All right. Greetings, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're thrilled to have a really excellent turnout already and expecting more. I'm Amy Antonucci. I am the chair of the board of the New Hampshire Peace Action Education Fund, and really glad to welcome you to tonight's Peace and Justice conversation for Monday, June 1st, 2026. We're really pleased tonight to have two speakers, Peter Kornbluh and Bill LeoGrande, who are going to discuss with us the U.S. policy of regime change in Cuba. For those who are new to joining us, for over 40 years, New Hampshire Peace Action has been educating, mobilizing, and organizing to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We do like to start with an acknowledgement that we do our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homelands of the Abenaki, Wabanaki, and Pennacook peoples, past and present. Quick reminder that we're happy for you to keep your video on so we can see folks. Your audio will be muted to start with. The chat will be open for questions. And later on, we'll probably allow some hand raising for the Q&A part as well. So I'm actually next going to hand it off to Diane Stradling. Diane is a New Hampshire activist, a longtime activist for the rights of Cuba. She's led many delegations and had taken many trips there herself. And she is the one who set up tonight's event, helped us make these connections and bring these two wonderful speakers to be with us. So Diane, I'm going to hand it to you to introduce them. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. And thank you to Bill and Peter for joining us tonight. I'm going to introduce them and they're going to speak for a while, and then we'll have an opportunity for people to ask questions, make comments, and join in on the discussion about what is going on these days with Cuba. So Bill LeoGrande is a professor of government and former dean of the American University School of Public Affairs in DC, and a longtime Latin American and Cuba researcher and teacher, and sharing lots and lots of information about Cuba. Peter Kornbluh is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive. He is a historian of U.S. Cuba relations and writes on that issue for The Nation magazine. He's also the author of Bay of Pigs Declassified. Both of these men co-authored Back Channel to Cuba, a book I cannot more highly recommend to read. It has so much information about Cuba that I would really hope that everybody will have an opportunity to get a copy of the book. It makes wonderful summer reading. So thank you. So let's start off. Bill, did you want to start?
I will, yeah. So thanks, Amy. Thanks, Diane. And thanks for everyone for joining us this evening. All of you, of course, are aware of the embargo that's been on Cuba since 1962. So I'm not going to go through the details of that because I think you all know about it. But I want to pick up really with the second Trump administration and talk through the way in which sanctions have been escalated since that time to really create or really put Cuba on the verge of a humanitarian crisis. Interestingly, last year, in the first year of the second Trump administration, the sanctions that were imposed were not much different than the sanctions in the first Trump administration. And that's because, unfortunately, Joe Biden didn't change much of what Trump did in that first term, which was reversing Obama's opening to Cuba from 2014 to 2016. So the real escalation in sanctions actually began this year. And of course, it was triggered by the seizure of President Nicolas Maduro and his wife in Venezuela on January 3rd. And the reason that that's important for Cuba is because after replacing Maduro with Delcy Rodriguez, the United States ordered the Venezuelan government to halt all oil shipments to Cuba. And Venezuela has been for years Cuba's largest supplier of oil. And so that was an enormous blow to the Cuban economy. Uh, it meant a loss from last year of about 16,000 barrels per day, which is how oil is measured, which is about 16% of Cuba's total consumption. And so it had a terrible impact. And Cuban oil was already running short because Venezuela's own production problems had led to about a 75% drop in the amount of oil Venezuela was already shipping to Cuba. So all of a sudden, the Cubans found themselves very, very short on oil. They only produce about 40% of what they consume domestically, and all the rest has to be imported. As I'm sure many of you know, Cuba's very short on foreign exchange currency, and so it's not able to import all the things that it needs. And the loss of Venezuelan oil, which was coming in exchange for medical services provided to Venezuela by Cuban doctors, nurses, and medical technicians, that was just a real blow because the Cubans didn't have the cash on hand to just go into the world market and replace it. But then on January 20th, just to be sure the Cubans couldn't replace that oil, the Trump administration issued an executive order that threatened to impose sanctions on any other country that shipped oil to Cuba. And the two biggest suppliers after Venezuela were Russia, sending about 10,000 barrels per day, and Mexico sending about 13,000 barrels per day in 2025. So now you're talking about, for Cuba, a loss of about 30,000 barrels per day of oil, or 30% of what they would normally consume. Mexico hasn't dared ship any oil to Cuba since those tariffs were threatened. Trump didn't actually impose the tariffs. Just the threat of the tariffs was enough to deter other countries from sending oil. Russia seemed prepared to defy this oil blockade. They sent one tanker about a month ago now, but they haven't sent another. And it looked like there was one on the way, and it stopped mid-Atlantic and now has turned away from Cuba. So it appears that whatever dialogue went on between Washington and Moscow, the Russians were convinced that they couldn't get away with sending another tanker of oil without it being seized by the United States. Now, on February 20th, those of you who follow these things closely will know that the Supreme Court ruled the use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act here in Washington. We call it IEPA. They ruled the use of that law to impose tariffs unconstitutional. And it affected not just the executive order threatening tariffs around Cuban oil shipments, but actually a long, long list of the tariffs that Trump has been imposing ever since April. So it invalidated that executive order, but countries are still afraid that the United States will find some way to punish them if they violate the oil blockade. And so far, no one's been willing to do it. Just the other day, the Cuban Minister of Energy announced that they had run out of oil and diesel reserves, that it was exhausted. It's critical because 80% of Cuba's electrical generation comes from thermoelectric plants that burn either oil or diesel. And so this is why electrical blackout, one of the main reasons that electrical blackouts are getting longer and longer all the time on the island. And across the island now, most places have electricity no more than a few hours per day. Public transportation's at a standstill, factories are closed, schools are closed. So it's a really desperate situation. I know Peter's going to talk a little more about that. On May 1st, as if all of this weren't enough, the Trump administration issued another executive order that threatens to impose secondary sanctions on any foreign company that's engaging with Cuba. If a foreign company is determined to be in violation of this executive order, the Treasury Department can declare them a specially designated national, which is a technical list of people and entities. Their assets in the United States would be frozen, and no U.S. person or company would be able legally to do any sort of transactions with them. So this is a kind of a death penalty for any foreign company that does business in the United States if they get designated under this executive order. And so you're seeing already companies begin to pull back from doing business with Cuba. The executive order itself is extremely broad, and it covers not only foreign entities that might be designated as in violation of this executive order, but it also threatens sanctions against any foreign entity that is engaged with a sanctioned entity. And to give you an example of this, on May 7th, the Canadian mining company, Sherritt International, which has a joint venture with Cuba, the Moa Nickel Mining Company, announced it was pulling out of the joint venture because of the threat of being sanctioned. And its accounting firm severed ties with Sherritt for fear that it could be sanctioned as well. So as I say, the risk is causing other companies to disengage. Both of the main cargo shipping companies that provide Cuba with its imports, drugs, food, fuel, obviously, have declared that they're suspending accepting cargo for Cuba for fear of being sanctioned. And as many of you probably know, Cuba imports 70% of its food. So if Cuba can't secure shipping companies to carry food to the island, that would be a prelude to famine. The goal of this executive order appears to be to drive all foreign businesses out of Cuba. So far, the Trump administration hasn't actually designated a foreign company and put them on this designated nationals, specially designated nationals list. But like the oil embargo, all it takes is the threat in order to drive companies away, because the cost of dealing with that kind of extreme sanction by the United States is so high for most companies, and the business they do with Cuba is so small in comparison that they simply won't persist in working with Cuba. Marco Rubio said not too long ago there were more sanctions to come. I would imagine it would be to begin listing some of these other foreign companies to make examples of them, to demonstrate that this threat of sanctions is absolutely real and every foreign company needs to take it seriously. If you're following the news, you know that the drums of war are beating more loudly every day. But I'm going to turn the forum over to Peter, who's going to talk about that in greater detail, and I think also talk a little bit about the limited negotiations that appear to be underway between Washington and Havana. Peter?
Thank you. First of all, it's a great honor and really important to be here, all of us together. I have great respect for the New Hampshire Peace and Justice Committee, and I think all of us would like peace, obviously, when it comes to Cuba, and justice for the Cuban people as well, who are suffering mightily under the sanctions that Bill LeoGrande just described. And what he was describing was basically the methodical and I have to say diabolical twisting of the economic screws by the Trump administration on Cuba. Twist, twist, twist. And the pressure that has been ratcheted up, which in Washington they like to call the maximum pressure campaign, has been extremely effective. Literally, the lights are shutting off in Cuba across the country from these methodical sanctions. Oil is needed to run the electrical grid, as Bill said. Without electricity, there is no water pumps that work in Cuba, so people can't get water. Without gas, there is no natural gas to turn on your stove. People are cooking in high-rise apartment buildings with charcoal and wood, which is incredibly bad for your health. If you get sick, there's no gas to put in your car to go to the hospital, and there's no lights in the hospital, and there's no doctors that can get to the hospital because they don't have access to gas either. The economy has been completely shut down. There's been an impact on the daily life of people, the ability of people to get to work. There's been a exodus of foreign investment, as Bill said. There has been a closure of essentially travel to Cuba, which is really the main kind of economic staple for the country. The big airlines that fly from Russia, from Canada, many of them from Europe, can't refuel once they get to Cuba and turn around and fly back. So progressively, those flights are being closed and stopped, and quite a few less people are coming to Cuba. And of course, the widespread press about the dire straits of the Cuban economy are certainly turning away tourism as well. And just recently, the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the Treasury Department has targeted humanitarian activists who carried aid to Cuba in March for an inquiry, alleging that they've perhaps violated the various restrictions on travel to Cuba and aid to Cuba. So there's just been a kind of a complete effort to move to isolate Cuba, with a small exception that the Trump administration clearly is trying to keep the private sector alive, which they see as their allies. And they've made some exceptions for the private sector, the private sector's ability to import its own fuel, keep its businesses running, perhaps have access to food, although they're going to have the same trouble as anybody else if the shipping companies won't actually ship the food to Cuba anymore. So that's going to be a very difficult situation. Now, Bill and I are the co-authors of this book, Back Channel to Cuba, which tells the entire history of dialogue with Cuba. And we are two historians who know that dialogue with Cuba is not only possible, but preferable, and that deals can be made between the United States and Cuba, because they have been many times over the years. There's a kind of popular mythology that the history of U.S.-Cuban relations has been entirely U.S. aggression towards Cuba, and Cuba standing up to the Colossus of the North. And there is that very extraordinary history that we all know. But there's also a lesser known history of the United States and Cuba engaging in secret dialogues to resolve various types of issues, whether it's migration issues, whether it's political prisoners issues, prisoner swaps, whether it's dialogue for normalization of relations. Obama normalized relations after 2 years of secret talks with the Cubans, but he wasn't the first one to try and do that. Those types of discussions go all the way back to the Kennedy era. And even Henry Kissinger engaged in very secret talks with the Cubans to attempt to normalize relations, which did not come to pass. But in this current crisis, we have seen some type of effort for a dialogue. And it started out as a back channel dialogue. The first reports, which are still very difficult to confirm, had Raul Castro's son, Alejandro Castro, who was the actual emissary for his father, Raul Castro, during the Obama Raul Castro secret talks. Alejandro supposedly went to Mexico and met with CIA officials in Mexico City, kind of under the umbrella of the office of the president, Claudia Sheinbaum. And those reports are hard to gauge, but it appeared that Cuba was reaching out after the U.S. attack on Caracas to try and address the issues that the United States had. Then, of course, we heard that Secretary Rubio's office was talking to Raul Castro's grandson, not his son, but his grandson, who goes by the name of Raulito, who's actually his security guard. He is head of his grandfather's security detail and more or less with him at all times. A lot of people kind of wondered why he would be the choice for the Cuban side. But, you know, it's not all that different than Trump using Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, to represent him around the world. Raulito is obviously part of the family. He can be trusted to carry the messages that his grandfather wants. He can be relatively trusted not to advance his own agenda, but the agenda of his grandfather and the Cuban government, et cetera. So it's not a big surprise that the Cubans would choose him. The United States seemed to be willing to deal with him because, A, he did represent the titular historical leader of the revolution who still has a lot of cachet in Cuba, even though he's about to turn 95 years old, Raul Castro. And because Raulito was known as a jet setter, more modern, young, not necessarily a diehard member of the Cuban Communist Party. So these talks started to happen. And under normal circumstances, given the history, we wouldn't have ever known about them. But our president seems to like to talk about these things. And almost every day for the whole month of February, he was saying, we're talking to Cuba. Cuba wants a deal. We're talking to Cuba. We're going to make a deal with them. They're begging for a deal. And the kind of notoriety that Trump kept bringing to this did bring leaks of actual meetings, including one on, I believe, February 24th. That took place in St. Kitts on the sidelines of the CARICOM meeting. The Caribbean nations have an annual meeting. And on the sidelines of this, Cuban diplomats and Raulito came, and Rubio and his entourage came, and there was a meeting there which was almost immediately leaked to the press. It's not clear by who. You know, publicity when it comes to secret dialogue is a problem. The dialogue's been very secret in the past, given the political sensitivities in Miami about any types of conversations between the United States and Cuba. And this is no different. As these meetings started to leak, there was, you know, uproar, pushback, discussion, demands from the Miami community. And you saw a change. You saw a change in Rubio, who was basically focusing in his public remarks about changing the Cuban economy and opening up Cuban economy to investment from foreign interests, meaning U.S. interests, to a change after these leaks happened, which was a demand that Cuba also change its leadership. And so that change started to take place in March. Somebody in the Washington leaked to the New York Times that one of the demands from the United States side was that Diaz-Canel, the president of Cuba, step aside so Trump could claim a scalp, basically saying he decapitated the Cuban leadership. And of course, that forced the Cubans to basically break their silence. To their credit, they have always maintained a very discreet position on these types of talks. Unlike Trump, their president wasn't going out and saying, we're talking to the United States, we're going to make a deal. They were very quiet about it, but eventually they were forced, and their president was forced to hold a press conference and concede that, yes, they had been having talks with the United States. Those talks were kind of in the initial stages. Agendas had to be set, meetings had to be held, and agreements had to be made. He really did, in one or two sentences, lay out how these talks really do happen. But by then, you know, I have to say, those of us who really thought that a dialogue would lead to a deal, I think started to feel like this was going in the opposite direction. And more threats from Trump came, including his famous open threat that that after all the presidents before him, he was the one that was going to, quote, take Cuba. I'm going to take Cuba, he said, and you know what? I can do anything I want with it. And when you have a president saying that, or one side of the dialogue saying that, you can imagine how hard it is for the other side engaged in that dialogue to basically continue in good faith. It's very difficult, given certainly the sovereignty and sense of independence that Cuba still has from its revolution, to simply ignore that type of bluster and those types of threats. And what we've seen, particularly in the last 2 weeks, is a kind of a 1-2 punch. Trump sent his CIA director, John Ratcliffe, on a mission to Cuba. It was an open mission. It wasn't a covert operation. It wasn't a covert back channel dialogue. He landed in Havana in a plane that said United States of America on its side of it and was blue and white. He went to a meeting with the head of the Cuban intelligence communities and Raulito Castro as well. Both the Cubans and the CIA issued statements after the meeting. It wasn't a covert operation at all. And I think that our first impression was, well, this is a good thing, because at least the two sides are talking, and obviously a CIA director is extremely high-level emissary. But it turns out that he was there to read the Riot Act to the Cubans, to issue an ultimatum. Do what we want, or bad things are going to come to you. Time is running out for any kind of discussion. You have to make the changes that we want. And of course, we don't really even know what those changes are, other than removal of Diaz-Canel and opening up the economy to U.S. investment. Then the second punch came, which was the indictment of Raul Castro last week. And that was a very threatening move on the part of the Trump administration, quantum escalation of kind of rhetorical and symbolic aggression. It sent a message straight to the Cuban leadership. Remember what we did in Venezuela. We indicted Nicolas Maduro, and then we sent the Delta Force in to seize him. Oh, and while we were doing that, we obliterated your entire security team that was guarding Nicolas Maduro, the Cuban security team. 32 members of that team were killed by U.S. Special Forces in the effort to seize, snatch, and return Nicolas Maduro and his wife to New York. So the Cubans understand they already have personnel who have died from such an operation, and now they understand that the threat to their own leader, Raul Castro, is real and could happen at any minute. And that is basically where we are now. Trump has gotten apparently impatient with the fact that the Cubans have yet to capitulate to the economic warfare that Bill described. And so he has ordered the U.S. military to prepare planning for actually attacking Cuba. And very openly, the U.S. military has been doing that over the last month or so. They've pre-positioned various types of weapon systems in the Caribbean. They have escalated surveillance operations over the island of Cuba, making sure that the Cubans know that those surveillance operations are taking place. Trump has mused to the reporters about bringing one of the battleships back from Iran, the USS Lincoln, positioning it off the coast of Havana, 100 yards off the coast of Havana, and having just the fact that it's there scare the bejesus out of the Cuban leadership. In his gunboat fantasies, the Cubans would come, as he told reporters, and say, "Thank you very much, we give up." And that is his sense of the idea of him pulling the levers of power and the Cubans just rolling over and playing dead. He is basically demanding that they bend the knee to the mad king of the North, the Colossus of the North, if you will. And that has been his approach to both threatening military action and his approach to negotiations. pressure until the Cubans completely capitulate, which they're really not going to be doing. And that's where we stand now. I'm going to stop talking, but basically, I think what we want to be thinking about is remembering the cost to the Cuban people that the economic warfare that's being waged at this very moment is taking, the toll that it is taking on daily human lives of Cuban families. This should be our message, that we should not be a country that does this, that has a collective punishment, as Bill likes to put it, on the entire Cuban population, and that a dialogue and some type of peaceful agreement is obviously in Cuba's interests and in our interests. And the cost to the United States of not having a dialogue, of attacking Cuba, creating upheaval, mass migration, destruction of property, are all pieces of the Pottery Barn merchandise, if you will, that'll be broken and that will have to be not just picked up but paid for by the American public to rebuild Cuba, rather than entering into a collective agreement with a reconstructed Cuban approach to its international economic structures and policies to have a different relationship with the United States. And so that's where we are today, and the type of work that needs to be done. The situation is rather desperate. You can imagine summer is coming full force in Cuba right now. The anniversary of the July 11th uprisings from 2001 is coming in just less than 6 weeks. The frustration of Cubans who can't refrigerate their food, who don't have any air conditioning, can't run fans, have to be outside their homes in order to even get a cool breeze, can't get food, etc. This is going to be serious. So the work is tremendously immediate.
Thank you so much, Peter and Bill. Folks, join me in thanking them. We're going to jump into questions. And let me say again, I'm going to direct folks to the chat, at least to start with. We're aware there are going to be lots of questions, and I want to fit in as many as possible. A little later, though, if you really want to ask yours instead, I will do hands, but I'm going to focus on the chat for now, and we already have some questions. I'm going to fold these first two into one. The question is essentially, why is Trump doing all this to Cuba? What is he hoping to gain from all the suffering? And I'm going to wrap in there. Evelyn was wondering, saying the U.S. says Cuba is a great threat to the U.S., just like they say about Nicaragua. Why do they see these tiny countries as threatening? Because they're communist? So kind of both of the question really being why.
Well, I'll take a crack at it first. I mean, part of the reason is that this administration has a conception of international relations which is based strictly on power and is also focused around spheres of influence. And so the recent national security strategy document that was released about 2 months ago specifically says the United States has to be preeminent in the Western Hemisphere. And Rubio has interpreted that in public to mean that the United States is not going to tolerate adversarial governments in this hemisphere. And so he points to Venezuela and Cuba. The claim, and lately he's been saying that Cuba is an immediate national security threat to the United States. Now, that's nonsense. The Cuban armed forces today is a shadow of what it used to be. They're operating with Soviet-era equipment, and they don't have gasoline and diesel either. But the claim is, and these claims, I should say, have been very systematically leaked to friendly reporters by the administration to begin to build a narrative that Cuba is a threat and we have to act against it. So first came the stories in the Wall Street Journal about Chinese spy bases. And that's now morphed into intelligence gathering sites for both China and Russia. Then there was a recent story that Cuba has acquired drones and is planning and is talking about plans to attack Guantanamo and Key West and maybe U.S. vessels at sea. Cuba, of course, is a member, or is a member, has been listed as a state sponsor of terrorism, which is also nonsense, but it provides a predicate for taking action against them. Now, all of these things are essentially rationales to basically give the administration a veil of a predicate if they decide to actually attack Cuba. And I think, and I'll just say one last word, I think the reason now is Marco Rubio.
Yeah, let me just say that the newest argument that Rubio in particular is making is that a failed state in Cuba is a threat to the United States. He's basically saying if Cuba collapses, there's a threat to us in the sense that there'll be disruption in the Caribbean and mass migration, and that's a threat to us. This has got to be the most hypocritical circular argument ever. The United States is pushing Cuba methodically and deliberately into a failed state status, and now arguing that if it becomes a failed state, that is a security threat to us, and therefore we have to act. And, you know, for I think all of us here talking tonight, that's an obvious hypocrisy and canard. But, you know, the way Trump is able to sell things to the American people, well, I don't know what to say about it, but he has, and that's the current threat that they're harping on, in addition to the idea that somehow Cuba's defensive systems are offensive threats to the United States. The whole issue of spying is very interesting because Trump just was in China. You might remember a week, 8 days, 9 days ago, just last week. And when he came back, as he was on the plane, the reporters were asking him, well, what about Chinese spying? Did you talk to the Chinese leadership about, all of its spying on the United States? And he says, you know what? They spy on us and we spy on them. And we do a lot of spying on them. And he voiced exactly the point. Nations spy on each other. It's the second oldest profession in the world. Nations spy on each other, and that's not necessarily a threat. It arguably helps the world be more stable in a sense that that nations, and particularly superpowers, are somewhat more aware of what their other would-be enemies are doing and not doing, as opposed to being in the dark about what is going on. So spying is not a threat either. The question is, why is Trump doing this? And, I think the answer is pretty simple. He would like to be an emperor. And to be an emperor, you need an empire. And he has been throwing this idea of acquiring new lands, expanding the United States territorially to Canada, to Greenland. Initially, he was going to take back the Panama Canal. He took Venezuela, and then he declared himself, you may remember, acting president of Venezuela. He started musing about making Venezuela the 51st state when it seems like it's a little bit too much to chew when to make Canada the 51st state. And I predict right tonight that if Trump does attack Cuba and overthrow the Cuban government, there will be an immediate effort starting in Miami and going straight up to the White House to acquire Cuba as a territorial appendage of the United States, whether it's a protectorate or a new state. You will see that movement coming down the road.
He is a real estate developer, after.
Yeah, and I think it seems like a frivolous answer, but in fact, I think it's a serious answer. What Trump really wants is to put his name, slap the name Trump on a bunch of Cuban hotels and have the golf resort Trump in Veradero Beach. And sometimes I think to myself, if the Cubans just would invite Donald Trump Jr. and the Trump organization to come to Veradero and offer them a lease on a couple of hotels there and say, we could see you modernizing the old DuPont golf course in Veradero, that all this might just go away. But Trump definitely is in the market for kind of extending his real estate empire, not just the U.S. empire, but his real estate empire in Cuba. Some of you may remember that he has tried several times over the last 20, 25 years, most recently in 2015, as he was just preparing to run for president, to have emissaries go to Cuba and actually negotiate a Trump organization acquisition or lease of Cuban hotels. That is a verified fact.
Okay, thank you. We have, as I expected, a lot more questions here. And actually, there wasn't one in the chat that I was sort of taking as a joke, saying, what if they just built a Trump tower? Would that be enough? But after what you just said, I kind of answered it, though. So let's see. The next one I'm going to ask you is Arnie's. Does it matter that an attack on Cuba, and for that matter, the ongoing attacks in the Caribbean and Eastern Pacific, are outside the law?
No.
Not to the administration. It ought to, of course. Whether it's the sort of thing that might finally motivate a handful of Republicans in Congress, because that's actually all you'd need is a handful to pass a war powers resolution in the House and in the Senate. But even that, of course, would only be symbolic because it doesn't have effect. It can be vetoed by Trump. But it would be at least, I don't know, a warning flare to the administration that the politics of this are running against them. There is a risk, I think, that some people in the administration may see Cuba as an easy win and making up for the fact that they've ended up in a quagmire in the conflict with Iran and can't figure out how to get out of it. So there is that danger. But yeah, the law, the Supreme Court gave him immunity for all official acts as president. So there's just no way to hold him accountable here in the United States. In The Hague, it might be different.
Okay, great. Thanks. Let's see. Here's one that's a little different, interesting one that I might add on to. Let's see. I'm going to ask it in two parts. Laura's great question that she sent me. First of all, she was wondering, in light of the U.S. government's hostility to engaging in dialogue and compromise, what are the most important ways for Americans to support Cuba? Is organizing for material aid the right way to go? And then she had some other questions. Let me add those here, and you can maybe break this up. I know this is a lot, but she's asking about a green transition in Cuba that would give them more autonomy and not be dependent on blockaded oil. And frankly, I think that's beyond Cuba, that question. And, for some of us also organizing around climate who want to, again, accelerate this green transition, it does feel a little funny to be trying to lift a blockade so that oil can flow more around the world. But of course, I know that's far more complex than that. But so what I think part of the question here is, are there ways we can support that?
Well, let me just say quickly that for the environmentalists in the group, that Cuba has suddenly, had an explosion of solar panel installations. Why it took a crisis like this to have that happen is part of what perplexes analysts and friends of Cuba. They could have done this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, but they didn't. And now China has stepped in, shipped boatloads of solar panels. There's kind of solidarity efforts to install panels in various clinics and hospitals. The private sector has already been installing panels over the course of time, but now is in a big rush. So as environmentalists, as historians of environmental movements look back, they're going to see this kind of sudden expansion of that in Cuba, which, you know, will be irrelevant if, in a sense, if Trump actually attacks Cuba and starts to destroy buildings. So that's a kind of a comment on the environmental side. There was another side of that question, Bill, which maybe you want to tackle.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, material assistance at this moment is important. You know, it may seem like a drop in the bucket, and in some ways it is, but being able to keep the hospitals operating with the necessary health equipment and medicine will save people's lives. So I encourage people. There are a variety of organizations that provide that. I see Bob Schwartz is on the call, and Bob's organization does a great job in terms of providing health materials to Cuba. And I think, you know, the other thing that people can and should do is try to mobilize grassroots pressure here in the United States. If you are represented by a Democrat who's been good on this issue, call them up and tell them how much you appreciate that, and they should keep doing it. So that they know that they're not, you know, they have constituents that are paying attention to this issue. If you're represented by a Republican, get in touch with them and tell them we're stuck in one war in Iran. We don't need a second one, and that you don't want to see American blood, and you don't want to see billions of taxpayer dollars having to go to Cuba to reconstruct the damage that the Trump administration is doing.
We can't afford environmentally either. Thank you. That's great. And I will say, one of the things that I have followed about Cuba is that as an organic farmer, we have studied their movement to embrace more, you know, the special period that led to a lot more organic and sustainable agriculture. It's been incredibly inspiring, although I'm upset to hear they seem to have moved away from that. If they're importing 70% of their food, I thought they were doing better than that for a while. Could you speak to that if you know?
No, I mean, no, the organic farms are still prospering. You know, about 20% of the arable land in Cuba is private farms, and there's another, I think, 20 to 30% that's in cooperatives, and they are, under the circumstances, productive. But the problem is it's a drop in the bucket. You know, Cuba's never been self-sufficient in food, ever, even though it has great farmland. It's always used that farmland, well, historically, of course, to produce sugar. And people don't realize it, but Cuba's 70% urban. So there's not a lot of farmers. And there's not a lot of people, you know, who were born and grew up in the city who want to turn around and go out and be farmers, especially when the economy's in such shape that you can't get fertilizer, you can't get seed, you can't get equipment. And so, you know, you're just struggling uphill at every turn.
Yeah, the issue of Cuba's agriculture is more of an issue of the Cuban system, and which just has not created the implements or the incentives for the type of agricultural production that can feed the population. And no amount of organic farming is going to come anywhere near addressing that problem. It is a problem for the future, but really the issue is what's going to happen right now, what's happening right now. So that means getting food to the Cuban people if there's any way to do that.
Sure. Yeah, I do think this is hopefully a wake-up call for people all around the world that being more in charge of our food and energy is what being, it brings safety to all of us. Okay, there's some questions here about our representatives, what we can do, and about legislative aspects of this. And there's been some sort of back and forth in the chat, but I think what I will say is, yeah, New Hampshire reps aren't fabulous on this. They're terrible on some piece things. They're okay on others. This one, not great. So this is something we should be pushing. I know, though, there are some saying there are no representatives, but that's not true, right? I mean, we have these war powers resolutions going forward with co-sponsors. So there are people in Congress working hard on this. And we can support what they're doing. Do you have other ideas around this, the legislative avenues, and how we can participate and push for change?
I think it's important, even if your member is not active on this issue, not outspoken, or even outspoken in a in a bad way, it's important for them to know that they have constituents who are keeping track of this issue and have strong feelings about it, and that it's going to determine their future support for their representative. And as I say, if it's a Democrat who's not being outspoken, urge them to be more outspoken. If it's a Democrat who is outspoken, thank them. Thank them profusely and encourage them to keep doing it. I think the three senators who've been the most active, Tim Kaine, Peter Welch, and Peter, help me with the third. We were just talking about this afternoon, actually.
Yeah.
I can't remember.
Is it Van Hollen?
Yes, exactly.
Holland.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Very good. And he's my senator. I should know.
Well, look, let's be concrete about this. If you have senators who voted against, who were Republicans and voted against the war powers resolution that Tim Kaine and others introduced, that fell short by 5 votes, I think, just 2 or 3 weeks ago. Organize what you would consider the most powerful delegation. Try and include church leaders, people of great influence in New Hampshire. Presumably, hopefully, a couple of them have been to Cuba and understand a little bit better what goes on there. And try and organize a meeting with those representatives, because there'll be a vote again, and basically make the argument: look, this is the cost to our own society. We don't want to be a society that deliberately impoverishes a whole population for a president to puff himself up. And we don't want to have to pay with our tax dollars for the rebuilding of Cuba afterwards. So go to them and organize these meetings, whether it's the congressmen or the senators, because these war powers resolutions are going to keep on coming. I think Diane was going to announce a new one of them that's coming up soon. But and this is the argument to make. Get a good writer among you and publish something, or go to the editorial board of the leading New Hampshire paper. Make this argument. But you have to take influential people with you, people who have broad constituencies in your state, in order for those powers that be to listen to you. That's the real issue. I mean, I know there are very good people in New Hampshire, and I'm sure that you can find those powerful folks to go with you.
Right. Thank you. We have had some luck in New Hampshire. Sometimes they do change their they answer what we are, when we push hard enough, we have had some results. Someone has asked to hear more about Bob Schwartz's organization.
Bob, if you're still here, you should be the one to do that.
Yeah, Bob, speak up.
Oh my goodness. Can I find Bob? Maybe if he puts up his hand. Um,
I just asked him to unmute, Amy.
oh, okay, thank you.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for Bill and Peter putting out tonight their take on what's happening in Cuba. As far as Global Health Partners goes, we're one of the larger donors of medicines, medical supplies to Cuba. Uh, we've got two campaigns right now. We've got a sutures campaign. Sutures are probably the single most important priority item at the moment. And we've already shipped close to $100,000 worth of sutures this year. We're looking to ship another 60,000. Surgeries are being postponed or canceled as a result of the lack of sutures. The other project that we're about to launch next month is probably one of the most innovative and most important projects or initiatives we've ever attempted, and that is Neonatal and Maternal Healthcare Initiative. When I started working in Cuba, the infant mortality rate was one of the greatest achievements of the revolution. Pre-revolution, infant mortality was 70 per thousand live births. And that was probably an understatement because a lot of people in rural areas were not being counted. When I started, the infant mortality rate was roughly 5.2, and it's now almost doubled. And there's a lot of reasons for that. The lack of equipment, malnutrition, lack of prenatal vitamins. And Peter and Bill didn't talk about emigration, but emigration has really impacted the public health sector more than any other sector. Entire surgical teams have left the public health sector because they can't afford to live in Cuba any longer. So there's a tremendous brain drain from Cuba, and it's impacting public health. So we've got a 2-year pilot project in Havana that we're going to launch in July. One of the reasons we're doing 2 hospitals in Havana is because of the fuel crisis that Peter had talked about. Originally, we had a hospital in Villa Clara, but it's impossible to project material out to the eastern part of the island on a regular basis. So we'll be launching that in July. And the hope is that working with the Ministry of Health, that we're going to be able to help reduce infant mortality, and there'll be more safe births and more healthy babies. So those are the 2 things we're working on right now. And if folks want more information, you can go to globalhealthpartners.org and take a look at what we're doing. So thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bob. I put that link in the chat. It seems like ghpartners.org is the way to get there. And how are you getting, I don't understand how you're getting stuff in despite the blockade. That's what I am not quite grasping.
Well, that's become a challenge in and of itself, to be honest. Amy, pre-COVID, we had a range of routes. We were shipping New York, Toronto, Toronto, Havana. And let me say from the outset, everything we ship is licensed for export. So we were shipping via Toronto. We were shipping via Bogota, Colombia. We were shipping Virgin through London. We were shipping Air France through Paris. All of those routes have been closed down. There's some passenger flights, but there's no commercial or humanitarian exceptions there. So for us, it's becoming a real challenge. We're able to send containers from time to time, but there too, Cuba doesn't have the fuel to extract containers from the Port of Mariel. So last week we got a huge shipment of meds in, just under $9 million worth of meds, and that went in via charter, via Miami. But those routes too are iffy. You know, the 2 areas, I think when we talked a little over a year ago, we thought perhaps travel and restrictions on air travel as well might be in the cards. And so far, the administration has not touched that. But who knows what they're going to do. So, Amy, it's a really challenging environment for us to be getting material aid into Cuba.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I will say, and we do need to wrap up here, but we've really had this issue with Gaza as well, that people want to give, people are willing to give, but we can't get anything in. That said, there are still organizations in many places, such as Cuba and Gaza, that are managing to do some really good work, and it's incredible. And we thank you for, hanging in there in such difficult, situations. It is saving people's lives, and we're really glad to have you.
Thanks.
I have to get off and talk to a Connecticut audience about Cuba. And so I do want to thank everybody. It's just so important to discuss this, and I just can feel the energy and the commitment to really standing up for American values and what's right. Truly, peace and justice.
So let's do a visible thanks to Peter and Bill. I do have a few more things to say, but since Peter has to jump off, thank you. I want to wrap up here. And I will say that tomorrow's action alert from New Hampshire Peace Action will be discussing the War Powers resolutions that are coming up. And yes, one of them is about Cuba. It was introduced last week in the House. So there are folks that are working on this, and we can support that. And let's just say if we don't, we know nothing good is going to happen. I put in the chat a link to the book, Back Channel to Cuba, so folks can check that out. And then let me just give you a little bit of info on some things coming up. Oh, first, the series is free, but we really do appreciate it when you're able to support us. So New Hampshire, nhpeaceaction.org/donate. And more than anything, we just hope that you will stay connected to us. This and other of our events are on our YouTube channel. That's in the chat, and we encourage you to send these around so other folks can be updated and in the loop and know what's happening. It's really, really great to spread the word. And we have such wonderful people who are willing to help us with that and tell us what's going on. Let's see, did I get that one in there? Okay, so then I want you to know nhpeaceaction.org is how you can check out what we're up to. Hopefully you're on our list or will join our email list. But here's a few things coming right up. Our vigils for a just peace for Palestine continue. Wednesday, June 3rd, 2 to 3, we're near Representative Pappas's office in Dover, New Hampshire, the corner of 3rd and Central Ave. Thursday, June 4th, noon to 1. People are at City Plaza in Concord, New Hampshire. Wednesday, June 10th, 2 to 3, Senator Shaheen's Dover office. We will be outside of. Our next Peace and Justice conversation via Zoom is Monday, June 15th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic will be Paths to Peace with Iran with our good friend Moji. And then the one after that is actually going to be about Puerto Rico, which is connected because militarization has been speeding up again at Puerto Rico. They're losing some ground to get rid of U.S. military because of this country staging and getting ready to invade Cuba and other places. So really important, Monday, June 29th, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. That's with Carlos Cardona, a New Hampshire resident who is from Puerto Rico. He'll come and speak with us. If you're in New Hampshire, please join us Sunday, June 28th, 12 to 4 for our New Hampshire Peace Action annual meeting at Bear Brook State Park. We'll tell you about our work, get your thoughts, have a potluck lunch, meet some pro-peace candidates that we've endorsed. There are some out there, we promise. Learn more about bird dogging, and we will have a Songs of Resistance sing-along. And with all that said, again, please do something visible to thank our speakers tonight, Bill and Peter, and to thank Diane for her great work on behalf of Cuba and human rights and for helping us put this together tonight. And, thank you all for engaging and for the work. It is frustrating. It is hard, but it really, really matters. So thank you all, and good night.